The historical record paints Georgian Britain as an age of elegance, refined architecture, grand estates, and high society. But that picture completely misunderstands how the system actually worked. For the vast majority, this was a high-stakes survival trap, built to protect the wealthy and punish the poor. So this investigation ignores the drawing rooms and looks instead at the machinery underneath. It is history from the bottom up, measured through physical endurance, legal risk, and the brutal reality of scraping by. We will examine the era's main survival strategies, from the coachman's high-speed gamble to the sailor's forced service, not simply as stories of hardship, but as a grim calculation of risk. Every path came with a price: physical exhaustion, disease, violence, prison, or death. By the middle of the 18th century, Britain's expanding turnpike roads fueled a wealthy obsession with fast travel. Driving these carriages, however, was a punishing, low-paid labor trap. Take the case of Jack Rann, born in 1750. At 18, he secured a position as a coachman. The job was a daily endurance test. A driver's main defense against the weather was a heavy, multi-caped greatcoat, vital in freezing rain, but suffocating in the summer heat. Rann worked from dawn to dusk and often drove through the night. His passengers sat inside padded cabins, protected from the worst of the journey. He got none of that comfort. When the carriage reached a coaching inn, wealthy travelers disappeared into hot meals and fresh beds. Rann's shift continued. He had to wash, brush, and feed the horses before bedding down beside them, sharing his quarters with stable fleas and ticks. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Rann earned a meager £10 to £15 a year. Yet, night after night, he watched his passengers casually spend money on fine wine and roasted meats. The gap between the filth of the stable and the luxury of the inn was enormous. For men trapped inside this system, poverty was not simply a lack of money. It was a structure that kept them there. The Georgian service economy needed laborers to keep the machinery of high society running, while giving them almost none of the wealth that machinery produced. For Rann, the numbers simply did not add up. So he made a calculated, high-stakes move into life as a highwayman. In the 1770s, with no organized police force and roads crowded with wealthy travelers, armed robbery offered a lethal but logical alternative to a lifetime of stable dirt. Known as 16-string Jack for his flamboyant silk breeches, Rann turned the very transport network he once served into a source of profit. He robbed travelers at gunpoint. It was an entrepreneurial gamble with a known, fatal expiry date. The law, built to protect property, eventually caught up with him. In 1774, after robbing a royal chaplain, Rann was sentenced to death. Before he was hanged, he danced a jig on the scaffold, a final, dark acknowledgement that in Georgian Britain, dying fast in silk could seem preferable to dying slowly in the mud. But not everyone who entered the machinery of the Georgian state did so by choice. Some were simply taken. In 1770, an Irish sailor named John Mara was seized in a Javan port by a press gang, a brutal recruitment mechanism that supplied up to a quarter of the Royal Navy's manpower. Once aboard a vessel like Captain Cook's HMS Endeavour, a sailor was reduced to a component in a floating factory. There were no private cabins for ordinary seamen. He was issued a hammock and had to find somewhere below decks to hang it. That was his entire living space. A strict physical and social line separated the crew from the officers. According to naval records, a Marine could shoot any sailor who crossed that boundary without permission. The ship itself demanded relentless maintenance. One of the most notorious tasks was holystoning the decks, scrubbing wooden planks for hours with a square of sandstone. It was supposedly about cleanliness. In reality, it also enforced discipline and mechanical obedience, leaving little room for idleness. And the food that fueled this labor was notoriously poor. The standard diet consisted of rock-hard ship's biscuit and heavily salted pork, sometimes stored for up to 3 years. To make the meat edible, sailors would tow it behind the ship in a net, allowing seawater to wash away some of the excess salt. The consequences could be catastrophic. Scurvy, caused by a severe lack of vitamin C, became one of the greatest killers on long voyages, claiming more lives than combat. The disease slowly dismantled the body. Gums swelled and bled, teeth fell out, limbs turned black. Then came death. Order was maintained through equally brutal means. For offenses as minor as perceived insolence, punishment could be swift. A sailor might be tied over a cannon barrel, a practice known as kissing the gunner's daughter, and flogged with the cat o' nine tails. A standard sentence could mean a dozen lashes, tearing open the skin of a man's back. For the press-ganged sailor, life became a constant negotiation with a hostile system. He fought against hunger, disease, exhaustion, and the absolute authority of the command structure. Service in the Georgian Navy was another high-stakes survival trap. A man's body was simply an expendable part of Britain's imperial machine. And if a Georgian labourer managed to avoid the gallows and the press gang, there was still another enemy waiting. The body itself could fail. For the working poor, a serious physical injury was a catastrophic mechanical failure. There was no modern safety net, no reliable insurance, no meaningful protection against the consequences of losing the ability to work. When a cart crushed a limb in the crowded streets of London, the only recourse might be a charity hospital. But even there, survival was uncertain. Georgian surgery was an exercise in brutal efficiency. Without anesthetic, patients were strapped to wooden tables, biting on leather, while surgeons operated in front of ticket-holding spectators. An amputation had to be fast, a circular incision, a rapid bone saw, minutes rather than hours, to minimize shock. But surviving the blade was only the first hurdle. With no understanding of bacteria or modern infection control, surgeons worked with unwashed instruments in sawdust-strewn theaters. Historical records indicate that post-operative infection claimed roughly 1 in 3 patients. For the lower classes, seeking medical treatment was itself a desperate gamble. Sometimes the cure was as lethal as the injury. And if the medical system was a lottery, the legal system was a rigged game. The Georgian legal framework was engineered to protect property, and the law could be weaponized against the starving underclass. By the early 19th century, more than 200 crimes carried the death penalty. Few examples expose this system more clearly than the laws surrounding poaching. In 1816, the government made it a capital offense for ordinary people to hunt wild game, reserving the forests for aristocratic sport. For men like Charles Smith, this created a fatal choice. Smith was a Hampshire labourer whose wages could no longer cover the rising cost of basic bread. His family was hungry, so he entered the underground economy of poaching. Armed with a musket and a terrier, he trespassed onto the heavily guarded estate of Lord Palmerston to hunt pheasants. What began as an attempt to feed his family ended in a violent confrontation with a gamekeeper. Smith was identified, hunted down, and eventually arrested. In 1822, he was tried and hanged. His execution exposes the ultimate Georgian paradox. A man could be legally put to death for trying to feed his starving children with a wild bird. The message was brutally clear. The state valued elite recreation and private property above the survival of the poor. And the dangers did not end outside the courtroom. Walk through Georgian London, expecting the polished streets of an imperial capital, and the physical reality would immediately choke you. The city was a densely packed biological hazard. Nearly 750,000 people were crammed into a relatively tiny area, while basic infrastructure remained dangerously inadequate. Human waste was routinely thrown into unpaved streets or flushed raw into the Thames. For the working poor, this filth was simply part of daily life. For single women, the economic pressure was even more severe. The capital offered a brutal binary: destitution or the sex trade, which consumed roughly 20% of London's young female population. But some women found another way. The illicit gin trade. Making and selling gin could provide a fragile form of economic independence. A woman could purchase raw spirit from a local distillery and process it at home. The product itself could be dangerously crude. If expensive juniper berries were out of reach, sellers could imitate the flavor using turpentine for a piney aroma and sulfuric acid for a peppery bite. It was toxic, unregulated, and potentially deadly. But it could still generate enough money to buy basic necessities and keep a woman out of the brothels. At first, the trade relied on high-traffic street hawking. Sellers targeted captive audiences at bare-knuckle boxing matches and public executions. But the scale of consumption became impossible to ignore. The public was drinking an estimated 7 million gallons of gin every year. So the government intervened, banning street sales in an attempt to curb mass addiction. The sellers adapted. Rather than surrendering the trade, they engineered a new delivery system, the Puss and Mew. Essentially, a hidden vending machine built into the walls of ordinary homes. A customer called out to a concealed operator, dropped a coin into a slot, and received a measure of gin through a lead pipe. The system was ingenious. It was also temporary. Like every Georgian survival strategy, the risks eventually caught up with the rewards. When informants exposed these hidden networks, the state responded with force. Operators were thrown into houses of correction and forced into hard labor, beating hemp in filthy conditions. The underground gin market was never a ladder out of poverty. It was a temporary buffer. Another workaround in an economic machine designed to keep the working class permanently suppressed. From the coachman's gamble to the sailor's forced service, from the surgeon's table to the poacher's gun, and finally to the gin seller's hidden network, the same pattern keeps appearing. The Georgian poor were not passive victims. They were resourceful survivors. They constantly engineered new ways around a system that was rigged for their failure. But every workaround came with a price. The coachman risked the gallows. The sailor risked disease and the lash. The injured worker risked infection. The poacher risked execution. And the gin seller risked prison and forced labor. This was the brutal physics of survival in Georgian Britain. A society celebrated for elegance and refinement was sustained by people living at the edge of exhaustion, poverty, disease, and death. The supposed Golden Age was not a miracle of culture. It was built on the labor and suffering of those who could not afford to escape it. The true cost is measured in these broken lives. History teaches us, if we choose to listen,